He was just a shadow under a rusted barrel, too tired to run, too broken to trust. She didn't speak. She just opened the garage door and waited. For the first time in years. He walked toward someone, but days later, when he saw the boots and the rope, he ran, into the snow, into the dark, and only a boy who barely spoke could bring him home. Maybe it wasn't just a dog finding shelter. Maybe it was God, reminding us that healing begins when love is quiet and patient. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Willowbrook, Virginia. Stirred beneath a curtain of pale fog that clung to the treetops like a whisper. It was early autumn, leaves had just begun to crisp at the edges, and the air carried the scent of pine needles and damp soil, far from the town's center, where laughter and porch radios still echoed faintly. An old log cabin sat quietly at the edge of the forest. That cabin belonged to Linda Graves. Linda was a woman shaped by both war and grief. In her 70s, tall and weathered, she moved with the kind of slow, deliberate grace that comes from decades of discipline. Her gray hair was always tied back. Her clothes and wool cardigans, heavy boots, and faded earth-tone trousers spoke more of practicality than style, but her eyes, a deep steel blue, carried stories that few had ever been allowed to hear. She had once been a combat nurse, tending to wounds in places most people only heard about on the evening news. But it wasn't the battlefield that left her withdrawn. It was Evan, her only son, a firefighter, brave and strong and always smiling, until the day the smoke didn't clear. That day broke something inside her. Since then, Linda had closed the door on the world. She declined neighborhood invitations, ignored letters from church friends, and lived mostly in silence except for the wind through the trees and the occasional crackle of firewood. This morning began like most others. She rose early, wrapped herself in her wool cardigan, and poured black coffee into her dented metal mug, with her wooden walking stick in one hand and the mug in the other. She stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking faintly beneath her boots. The air was crisp. The forest ahead shimmered faintly in the golden slant of dawn light. Linda followed a familiar path down behind the cabin, where a narrow dirt trail led through grasses and low brush to the edge of the clearing. The birds were quieter today. Only the wind made a sound, soft and uncertain, as if not yet ready to commit to autumn. Then she saw it, across the field, near the tree line where the pines met the open ground. A dog stood watching her. He was barely more than a silhouette at first. As she took a few steps forward, the shape came into clearer view, a German shepherd, thin to the bone, with a ragged coat of gray and black fur that hung like an old coat in the rain. His stance was still, stiff but not aggressive. His head was low, ears slightly back, the kind of posture that came not from defiance but from deep, hard-earned caution. He didn't bark, he didn't growl, he simply stared. Linda's heart skipped, not from fear, but something older, softer. She stopped walking, watched him, waited. The shepherd stared back for a few long moments, then, in a single fluid motion, he turned and slipped silently into the shadows between the trees. No sound, no rustle, only the space where he had been, and the echo of his gaze lingering in Linda's chest. She stood there a while, staring at the empty edge of the woods. Then, with a long, quiet breath, she turned and began the slow walk back toward her cabin, her stick tapping gently against the roots beneath her feet. Her coffee had gone cold, but she didn't seem to mind back inside. She sat by the window for a long time, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the tree line beyond the field. She didn't speak aloud, she didn't cry, but something had stirred. She didn't know his name, or where he had come from. But she knew one thing for certain. He had run. Because that's what pain teaches you to do, and for the first time in years, Linda Graves felt less alone. The next morning, the sky over Willowbrook turned a dull, pewter gray. The scent of rain hovered in the air, clinging to the wind that rustled through the tall pines. Linda Graves stepped out of her cabin with a Tupperware container in hand, steam curling from the coffee mug pressed to her lips. Her footsteps were steady but quieter today, more thoughtful. She walked past the patch of withered wildflowers and down the narrow trail that led to the field behind her house. The trees at the edge of the clearing stood motionless in the thick morning air, waiting. Linda placed the container, filled with rice, cooked chicken scraps, and a few pieces of apple, gently on a flat stone. Then, as always, she sat on the old split-log bench and waited. There was no sound at first, no sign of the dog, but Linda had learned that Harper never approached while she was looking. She turned her gaze toward the sky, watching dark clouds gather like memories, heavy and slow. After 20 minutes, she rose and walked back home. She didn't need to see him. The food would be gone by sunset. It always was now. She'd given him a name 2 days ago. Harper, spoken into the wind like an invitation. There was no collar, no tag, and no chip when she called the animal shelter just to check. No one was looking for him. Or maybe, Linda thought grimly, they didn't want to. Harper had never let her come closer than 10 feet. He would hold his ground some mornings, standing still, ears twitching, tail lowered, not tucked, but ready to bolt if needed. His eyes were always sharp, watching her as if trying to decide whether she, too, would someday strike. But he was coming closer. That much was certain. She no longer had to leave the food and flee. He accepted her presence now, at least from a distance. That afternoon, the storm arrived. It began with low rumbles that rolled through the hills like distant drums. Then came the wind, thick and sharp, pulling at tree limbs and tossing dead leaves like confetti from forgotten parties. Linda pulled in the porch chairs, double-checked the windows, and fed the fire inside her stove. By nightfall, the sky had opened. Rain lashed against the cabin roof in hard, uneven bursts. The trees groaned. Thunder shook the floorboards. Linda, wrapped in a wool blanket, stood by the window, unable to rest. Something gnawed at her chest, not fear, not quite, a weight, a worry. She stepped into her boots, threw on her thick coat, and lit the lantern by the door. Wind pushed against her as she opened it, the rain cold on her face. Behind the cabin, half sunken into the soil, sat an old rusted tin barrel, something Evan had used to store firewood when he was younger. Its lid was gone, the edges dented. She hadn't touched it in years. And there, inside it, barely visible under the flickering beam of her lantern, was Harper. He was curled up as tightly as his long limbs allowed, soaked to the bone, trembling. His head was pressed against the metal wall of the barrel, and his eyes were open, but he didn't move. Linda crouched slowly, her knees protesting. "You poor thing," she whispered. Her voice nearly lost in the rain. She didn't reach out, just stayed close after a few seconds. Harper shifted his gaze toward her. There was no growl, no attempt to run, only a quiet surrender, too tired to resist. Without a word, Linda rose and walked back to the house. She unlocked the side door leading into the garage, a space that once held tools and memories, now half empty and smelling of pine shavings and dust. She spread a wool blanket near the wall, laid down a clean bowl of water, and left the door slightly ajar. Then she returned to the barrel. It took some coaxing. A few quiet steps back, a nod of patience, and finally. Harper stood, shaking, unsure, and limped slowly past her, into the warm, dry dark of the garage. She closed the door gently behind him. A few houses down the gravel road lived a boy named Jamie Wheeler, 9 years old and slight for his age, with a mop of chestnut hair that always seemed to fall in front of his eyes. Jamie lived with his maternal grandmother, Mrs. Edith Wheeler, a retired schoolteacher with a sharp tongue and a soft center. Jamie's parents had divorced when he was 3, and his mother had moved to another state. Leaving him in Edith's care, Jamie was quiet, not shy exactly, but hesitant in a way that made people whisper. He had been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder and selective mutism at age 6. The doctors gave names. The neighbors gave looks. Edith gave him space and love in equal measure. Jamie didn't speak often, but he drew, always drawing. His notebooks were filled with pages and pages of animals, some realistic, some fantastical, but always alone, always surrounded by white space. His favorites were dogs, German shepherds, in particular. He had never met one in real life, only seen them in pictures or on television, but he loved their eyes, the way they looked as if they understood things no one ever said aloud. Every morning, Jamie would sit on the windowsill of the upstairs bedroom and sketch. The window cracked open just enough to let in the scent of pine needles and smoke. That morning, between claps of thunder, he saw something move behind the Graves cabin, a flash of gray-black fur, a tail vanishing through a cracked door. He grabbed his pencil and started to draw. Linda spent most of the night sitting in the kitchen, listening to the storm and the occasional shuffle from the garage. She didn't check on him, didn't want to push. But when she stepped out at dawn, the first thing she saw was Harper, sitting just inside the garage door, watching the rising sun with the same quiet intensity she had seen in him at the tree line. She didn't speak. She just nodded and poured 2 bowls, one with warm broth, the other with rice and leftover chicken, and slid them just past the threshold. Harper waited until she stepped back. Then he ate. Something shifted in the air between them. Not quite trust, but the beginning of permission. The sun returned slowly to Willowbrook after days of wind and wet, painting the town in soft golds and silvers that glistened across rooftops and fence rails. The storm had passed, but the air still held a heaviness, like a breath not yet fully released. In the cabin, by the edge of the woods, Harper slept near the stone hearth, curled tightly on a blanket Linda had folded just for him. His breathing was deep and steady now, his ribs no longer so sharply defined. Linda Graves moved slowly around the room. The morning light filtered in through the narrow windows, warming the floorboards and softening the lines on her face. She knelt carefully, her knees stiff, and dipped a clean rag into a basin of warm water. Harper stirred as she approached, but didn't move away. He was still thin, perhaps 2 or 3 years old, but weathered in a way that made it hard to tell. His coat, once matted and dulled, had begun to regain some of its natural sheen. Black streaks rippled down his back and legs, while ash-gray tufts softened his face. His eyes, however, remained alert, always watching, always halfway between now and some terrible memory. Linda crouched beside him, whispering gently as she wiped the edge of his front paw, where an old wound had reopened in the storm. Harper flinched once, then stayed still. She cleaned the rest in silence, her hands steady and slow, when she finished. He did something that stopped her breath. He rested his chin on her knee. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. That night, Linda laid a second blanket beside the hearth and sat across from him, her back to the fire. The crackle of flame filled the silence between them. She didn't try to speak, but every now and then, she looked over and smiled. The following afternoon, Linda walked into town for the first time in weeks. It was a slow journey, about a mile down a gravel road that wound past fields, old mailboxes, and sagging barns. The sky was a soft, cloudless blue. Harper, to her surprise, followed, at first from a distance, then a few paces behind, his steps quiet and unsure. They passed Mrs. Langley's front porch, where the old woman was hanging bird feeders, then the corner store, where a battered wooden sign swung in the breeze. Linda only went to town when necessary. She didn't care for small talk or pitying glances, but today she felt lighter. Maybe it was the clear sky, or maybe the dog at her heels. As she neared the post office, a boy's voice called out, a sound more like a question than a greeting. "Dog." The voice came from the other side of the road, near a hedge of trimmed boxwoods. Linda turned. It was the boy from the Wheeler house. She recognized him now. Jamie. He stood halfway behind the hedge, a sketchpad tucked under one arm, a pencil in his hand. His brown hair was unkempt, and his eyes were large and uncertain. He wasn't staring at her. He was staring at Harper. Harper paused mid-step. His ears twitched forward, then back for a long second. He and the boy just looked at each other. No sound, no movement. Then, slowly, Harper walked toward Jamie. Linda froze. She expected Harper to stop halfway, or retreat, but instead he approached, carefully, quietly, and sat down, just a few feet from the boy. Jamie didn't speak, but he didn't step back, either. His fingers clenched the sketchpad tighter, his lips parted, barely, "Hi," he whispered. It was a real word, spoken aloud, not to his grandmother, not to a doctor, but to Harper. Linda blinked in surprise, and before she could say anything, the screen door of the Wheeler house creaked open. A woman stepped out, short, round-shouldered, in a faded red cardigan and worn jeans. Her silver hair was clipped short and neat, and her face, though lined, carried a gentle firmness. Rosemarie Wheeler. She looked across the lawn and paused, eyes narrowing. "Linda," she called. Linda hadn't heard her name spoken in that tone in years, half surprise, half buried memory. Rosemarie stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Well, I'll be—" Linda turned toward her with a slow nod. "It's been a long time. Too long," Rosemarie replied, then glanced at the dog, who had now lowered his head near Jamie's outstretched hand. "That him? The one Jamie's been drawing every day. Guess so," Linda said. "His name's Harper." Rosemarie descended the porch steps and approached with careful familiarity. She stopped beside Linda, folded her arms, and tilted her head. "I never thought I'd see you this close to town again," she said quietly, "let alone walking with a shadow like him." Linda's smile was small, but genuine. "I guess we're both figuring out how to trust again." There was a pause. Then Rosemarie exhaled, something easing in her shoulders. "You should come by sometime," she said. "For tea. You know Jamie, he doesn't talk to anyone. But that dog's done more in 5 minutes than the counselors did in 2 years." Linda hesitated, but then she looked at Jamie, who was now kneeling on the grass beside Harper, both of them silent, both of them at peace. "I think we'd like that," she said. That night, Harper lay on the rug near the fire again, but closer than before. Linda sat in her rocker, a book in her lap. Though she didn't read much of it, she kept glancing at the dog, watching how his ears flicked in sleep, how his body had finally relaxed into the warmth, and outside, in a house just down the lane. A boy named Jamie sketched the scene from memory, a dog, a woman, and a fire between them, for the first time. He added color. Snow had begun to fall again over Willowbrook. Light at first, like powdered sugar dusting the pine boughs and porch rails. The weather forecast had called for a minor flurry, but Linda knew how quickly the mountains could turn a whisper into a storm. She had already laid extra firewood by the hearth and added a thick rug near Harper's favorite spot by the stove. He was curled there now, his body relaxed, eyes half closed, one ear always twitching at the smallest sound. Linda had begun to notice the rhythms of his trust. He tolerated the brush now, though only if she moved slowly. He came to her when she called, but only in her voice, low, calm, never rushed. He didn't like sudden movement, and the broom leaning in the corner still made him freeze. But it was progress. Quiet, undeniable progress. On a Saturday afternoon, as the sky began to cloud again, Linda took Harper into town for the first time since the snow. She didn't put him on a leash. He didn't like ropes or collars, but he stayed close to her heel, stepping lightly as if the ground itself might shift beneath him. They were headed to the post office to mail a package, a simple errand. She had timed it carefully, knowing most people would be indoors sipping soup or watching weather reports, but not everyone was inside. In front of the hardware store across the street stood a man Linda didn't recognize, Tucker Briggs, a new arrival in town, perhaps in his late 40s, with a wiry frame and wind-burned face. He wore a forest green jacket with padded elbows and tall, mud-spattered rubber boots that came nearly to his knees. A long yellow rope coiled under one arm. He had the rough look of a man who worked with livestock. Practical. No nonsense. With hands like cracked leather. Tucker had just finished loading feed into his pickup and turned at the sound of Harper's paws across the icy pavement. Linda felt it first, a ripple in the air, and then saw Harper's entire body change, his ears pinned back, his shoulders lowered. A low growl rumbled from his throat. Before Linda could speak, Harper bolted. It was so fast she didn't have time to move. He took off down the side alley beside the bakery, paws slipping slightly on the wet stone, and disappeared into the woods behind the town hall. Linda stood frozen for a beat, heart pounding. Then she turned toward the Wheeler house, just down the block. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. Jamie was on the porch, bundled in a heavy navy coat with a green knit scarf and fingerless gloves. His cheeks were pink from the cold, and he was sketching quietly, curled on the swing. Linda climbed the steps, breathless. "He ran," she said, "into the woods. I need your help." Jamie didn't hesitate. He dropped his sketchbook and followed her without a word. The forest behind the town hall thickened quickly, the trees growing closer together as the snow deepened underfoot. Linda carried a flashlight. Jamie, a headlamp strapped over his knit cap. They didn't speak, only called Harper's name at intervals. Jamie's voice faint but clear in the cold. They walked for 20 minutes, then 30, the snow now falling faster, stinging against their cheeks. Jamie paused beside a row of pines, squinting. "There," he whispered. Beneath a wide, low-hanging white pine was a shape, small, dark, curled tightly in the snow. It didn't move. Jamie didn't wait. He stepped carefully through the underbrush, his boots sinking softly. Linda stayed back, afraid her presence might startle Harper further. Jamie crouched beside the trembling dog, moving slowly, his breath visible in the chill air. "Harper," he said, barely above a whisper. "You're safe now." Harper didn't bolt, he didn't growl. He stayed where he was, chest rising fast but steady. Jamie reached out and placed his small hand on the dog's back, gently, and waited. And something shifted. Harper let out a long, low sigh and leaned into the boy's touch. Linda approached quietly, her eyes stinging, not from the cold. They walked home together, Harper between them, and not once did he look over his shoulder. The following week, the snow still clung to the eaves and sidewalks, but Willowbrook Elementary reopened with 2-hour delays. On Friday morning, Mrs. Keene's 4th grade class gathered in a circle to share their special moment of the week. Part of a new encouragement activity the principal had introduced. When it was Jamie Wheeler's turn, the room went quiet. Everyone expected the usual, the shy shake of the head, the soft shrug, maybe a quiet doodle offered instead of words. But Jamie stood, his shoulders were tense, his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "My dog," he said. Every head turned. "His name is Harper. He was scared of everything. But he's not anymore. I helped find him in the woods, and he trusts me now." He didn't say more. He didn't have to. The room held its breath. And then, softly, they clapped. Even Mrs. Keene, who had taught for 27 years, blinked more than usual behind her glasses. Jamie sat down slowly, face flushed, but in his heart, something had cracked open, a door that had long been closed, now letting light in. Spring arrived slowly in Willowbrook, as if the mountains themselves had been holding their breath all winter and were only now ready to exhale. Crocuses pushed up through thinning snowdrifts. The trees, still bare-limbed, reached toward a gentler sun. The air had shifted, warmer, fuller, carrying the scent of thawing pine and damp soil. And with the change in season came a change in rhythm. Linda Graves stood at the edge of the old community hall, a clipboard in hand and a soft blue scarf knotted at her throat. Her cardigan was lighter now, her steps steadier. The town had gathered, not for a fair or a meeting, but for something new, something Linda herself had not imagined she'd be part of just a few months before. The hand-painted sign read, "The Quiet Companions Project," a space for healing through fur, pause, and presence. It was a modest program, held in the converted back room of the community hall once a week. Linda had organized it with help from Rosemary Wheeler and the quiet encouragement of the town's new veterinarian. Dr. Henry Locke, a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s with a kind voice, salt and pepper beard, and a habit of humming softly while taking notes. He had grown up in Vermont, spent years in Chicago's bustling animal shelters, and moved to Willowbrook after losing his wife to illness. His calm demeanor and steady hands made him a favorite among both pets and people. The program was simple, a gathering place where children with social challenges and elders facing isolation could spend quiet time with rescued animals. There were no forced conversations, no structured therapy, only couches, cushions, warm tea, and the gentle rustling of movement and fur. And always, at the center of it all, was Harper, now clean, well-fed, and a touch fuller in his frame. Harper had become more than just Linda's dog. He was a symbol, a creature that had once been a shadow, and now walked confidently among strangers. He moved slowly through the room, stopping beside an elderly man in a flannel shirt and oxygen tank, nudging his hand until it rested lightly on his back. Then he settled beside a young girl named Avery, who hadn't spoken in 3 weeks. She traced the lines of his ear with her fingertip as if it were a map back to something she had lost. Jamie came every week. Of course, he had become Harper's unofficial handler, dressed in jeans and his now favorite green scarf. He guided the children in how to approach Harper, soft voice, open hands, no sudden moves. He didn't need to speak much. Harper did most of the talking. In his own quiet way, Linda watched them all from the corner. Her hands folded over her clipboard, heart fuller than she remembered it could be. Outside of program hours, the four of them had formed something like a family. On Sunday mornings, Linda, Jamie, Rosemarie, and Harper often went on long drives into the hills, parking near the forest's edge and hiking in with thermoses and folded blankets. Jamie carried his sketch pad. Linda carried her walking stick, though she needed it less now. Rosemarie always had cookies wrapped in wax paper and stories that spilled out like warm syrup. Light-hearted tales of her youth, her students, her stubborn brother who once tried to tame a goose and failed spectacularly. One afternoon, they found a small clearing beneath a maple grove, where the red-gold leaves from last fall still lingered in soft piles. They unpacked sandwiches and thermoses of cocoa. Harper chased a squirrel half-heartedly, then flopped beside Jamie, his tail swishing lazily in the moss. Jamie sat cross-legged with a book in his lap, not drawing, for once, reading aloud. His voice was quiet, but steady. Harper's head rested on the boy's shin, eyes half closed, his ears flicked with every word. Linda sat nearby, watching the scene with the kind of smile that comes from a place deeper than joy. It was contentment, a fullness not of sound, but of presence. Rosemarie passed her a cookie and said, "I think Evan would be proud." Linda nodded, her throat too tight for words. The sun filtered down through the branches, catching the curls in Jamie's hair and the silver in Harper's fur. The moment didn't need a caption, it didn't need explanation, because this was family, and none of them shared a last name, but they shared healing, and that was enough. Sometimes, healing doesn't come in grand moments or loud miracles. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a frightened dog who learns to trust, a boy who dares to speak, or an old woman who chooses to love again. In Harper's journey, we are reminded that the smallest acts of kindness can create the greatest transformations, and perhaps, just perhaps, that is how God works, in silence, through broken hearts finding one another, and in families formed not by blood, but by grace. If you believe that no soul is too lost to be found, that healing is possible through love, and that God places the right souls in our path at the right time, then this story is for you. Share this video with someone who needs a quiet reminder that hope is still alive. Leave a comment to tell us how this story touched you, and type Amen if you believe that God still works through the unexpected. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of redemption, love, and second chances. May God bless you and all the Harpers out there who are still learning to trust again.